Mo meaning number 4. Where's my intro?
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're also plugged in as nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.
So this is the 4th installment of my Maps of Meaning series, where I'm going over each page of Maps of Meaning, sort of in a close reading fashion, if you're not familiar with the other parts of the series, and you might be clicking on this for the first time. This is a little bit of art I had done about Jordan Peterson and some of his influences. I said I would show the full image last week at the end, and I forgot to upload that image. So I might post it on my Twitter maybe tomorrow. Speaking of my Twitter, I just want to do a plug. This is my Twitter here, at GoldJBP. And it shows up as Gold Rush here. You can see I have the same icon as my profile picture. And this is just a sample of some of the things I put on Twitter. It's not just me promoting my videos, although half of the time I am promoting the videos. I'm also trying to come up with other content that's sort of suitable for Twitter. You know, little bites of information. So sometimes it's funny, and sometimes it's stuff from Karl Barth or the Bible or something like that. But in this case, I tweeted out the Sam Harris versus Jordan Peterson creating their worldviews, and I picked this as Sam Harris after seeing those discussions, those 4 discussions they had together, and he's creating with his little tiny arms that can't even reach and manipulate the world as it really is, his worldview, and which is really just a pitiful bundle of sticks. And here's Jordan Peterson creating his worldview. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory, and I kind of find it hilarious. If you're into this kind of thing, just please follow me at GoldJBP on Twitter. But now let's move on to Maps of Meaning, and I'm going to recap the first 3 pages and then get to the 4th. And I'm going to do this every time just so that I think it helps drill in the book into your brain better to hear it sort of every week over and over again. And I have these one-slide summations of those other pages. So the world, we open the book with, the world is a form for action and a place of objects. To have a complete world view, you need to incorporate both of these things. And think about the talks Jordan had with Sam Harris. Now I've seen all 4 of them. The more I think about it, the more I think that Jordan, of course, prepared Maps of Meaning many years ago. And he was going to take on Sam as someone who is opposing his viewpoint, but perhaps someone who is willing to take the steps necessary to understand his viewpoint, and he might concede some points, and maybe he'll come on board the Maps of Meaning train. Now, of course, that didn't happen. As Vanderklay says, as Jordan built up his blocks on stage, Sam would just knock them down. But if you look at Maps of Meaning, you know, Jordan has to try to lay out the framework right away. So on page 1, you had basically discussion 1. And on page 2, you had discussion 2 with him and Sam Harris in Vancouver. And page 3 was discussion 3, and page 4 was discussion 4. Now, I know there's other reasons for that, but to me it seems like Jordan could only get about 4 pages into Maps of Meaning with Sam, and that's kind of sad. And it's not like Jordan didn't try. He tried over and over again to get further into it, but Sam just wouldn't let him get there. So anyway, I'll get back to this. So myth provides us with the world as a form for action with meaning. Science provides us with the world of objects as sense data. Confusion arises between things only because their domains are not sufficiently discriminated. Myth is for meaning. Science is for objects. What ought to be and what is. What ought to be is where myth comes in, and what is what science describes. You could also think of that as prescriptive and descriptive knowledge. So a prescription is something that's sort of, it's something you ought to do, like I said there, and a description is just something that is. The child's mind searches out meaning and places this above sense data. Now this is on page 2, where he gives the example of a child exploring a glass sculpture. Meaning is how to act in the world, and this is nested into our socio-cultural context. The meaning of an object is inextricably linked with the object itself as sense data. And now for page 3, I'm pulling in something that he said on stage with Sam, that soccer is not just a game, because this is very fitting to page 3. And I think he said it in his third discussion, or maybe the second discussion. An antique chair is not just a chair. There's intersubjective values that are real, and these are they're just as real as objective properties. So this is where him and Sam kind of clashed, where Jordan wasn't so sure that Sam was fully acknowledging these intersubjective values, and Sam said, "Of course I am." And I think Sam didn't quite understand if Jordan was acknowledging the objective properties of things, and of course Jordan said, "Yes, of course I am." So there's a reason behind our irrational attitudes towards movie stars and things we attach sentimental value to. There are layers of meaning laid over the material world. One of those layers is the layer that has kept chaos at bay for civilization, for humanity. It's deeply rooted into our psyche. And some would say, now, maybe it's rooted into our brain? Some might say soul, and maybe a Jungian may say unconscious. But I think Jung was also partial to the word psyche, and I think Jordan Peterson goes, I think, all over the map into how he refers to things. I've seen him use soul, brain, psyche, and unconscious. And I think that just shows you how diverse his thinking is. Now, some may criticize it as confused or mixed up. I really see it as diverse and not negatively. Like I said before in other videos, he's a both and kind of thinker, not an either or. And you might see that in, if you want to relate that to knowledge and science in general, Newtonian type of physics is sort of an either or type of thing. And then when you get into relativity, and then maybe, even something crazier like quantum mechanics. So I think it was Einstein or something who understood that light could be both a photon and a wave, and this was kind of a mysterious thing. And then as you got further into the smaller world of physics, into the quantum world, then you started to see that there's such a thing as a superposition, and so you kind of have two positions being held at the same time. Anyway, that's just sort of like an example. It's not like it's exactly the same thing. But I think it shows you how knowledge progresses, where at first something seems like it can only be this or that. And then when you take a closer look, it could actually be both this and that. And that's important to understand. And I think it gets, I'm going to touch more upon this in the second part to my Jordan Peterson paradox video. Anyway, so knowing how to act in your social group is at the top of your sense perception. A thing is not even perceived if it isn't perceived as relevant. And there's some conundrum with that as well, but I won't get into that right here and right now. But Jordan has said that. And I believe it's all verified by experimental data. So this is the last part of page 3, and it kind of leads us into page 4. And I'm going to give it a reading, and then I'm going to go and break it down bit by bit. First, after the reading, I'm going to point to a couple of interesting outside resources that kind of tie into this. One kind of more so than the other, although I think this Zarathustra reading is very interesting and kind of related, but you'll see what I'm talking about. And after that, I'm going to continue on to the analysis of page 4. So the things that existed prior to the development of experimental science do not appear valid either as things or as the meaning of things to the modern mind. The question of the nature of the substance of soul, the sun, to take a single example, occupied the minds of those who practiced the pre-experimental science of alchemy for many hundreds of years. We would no longer presume even that the sun has a uniform substance unique to it, and would certainly take exception to the properties attributed to this hypothetical element by medieval alchemists, if we allowed its existence. Carl Jung, who spent much of the latter part of his life studying medieval thought patterns, characterized soul, quote, "The sun signifies first of all gold, whose alchemical sign it shares. But just as the philosophical gold is not the common gold, so the sun is neither just the metallic gold nor the heavenly orb. Sometimes the sun is an active substance hidden in the gold, and is extracted alchemically as the tincture rubea, red tincture. Sometimes, as the heavenly body, it is the possessor of magically effective and transformative rays. As gold and a heavenly body, it contains an active sulfur of a red color, hot and dry. Because of this red sulfur, the alchemical sun, like the corresponding gold, is red. As every alchemist knew, gold owes its red color to the admixture of copper, which is interpreted as Kypris, the Cyprian Venus, mentioned in Greek alchemy as the transformative substance. Redness, heat, and dryness are the classical qualities of the Egyptian Set, the evil principle which, like the alchemical sulfur, is closely connected with the devil. And just as Typhon had his kingdom in the Forbidden Sea, so the sun, as Sol Centralis, has its sea, its crude perceptible water, and as Sol Coelestis, its subtle imperceptible water. This sea water is extracted from sun and moon. The active sun substance also has favorable effects. As the so-called balsam, it drips from the sun and produces lemons, oranges, wine, and in the mineral kingdom, gold. We can barely understand such a description, contaminated as it is by imaginative and mythological associations peculiar to the medieval mind. It is precisely this fantastical contamination, however, that renders the alchemical description worth examining, not from the perspective of the history of science, concerned with the examination of outdated objective ideas, but from the perspective of psychology, focused on the interpretation of subjective frames of reference. So here's where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to go on to Alchemy and Dorn. And this is an interesting little book you might want to look into by Marie-Louise von Franz, who was, this particular book is about Alchemical Active Imagination, which is based on her lectures given in 1969 at the C.G. Jung Institute. She was one of the top students of Jung, and so to give you a little taste of this, and so you could see some more than what Jordan quoted there from Jung, she starts to quote this guy called Dorn, who was a very famous alchemist that Jung discovered or helped discover. And so Dorn writes, so these are the original sort of alchemical writings translated into English, because I believe Dorn wrote everything in Latin, even though he was German. He says, "We give that which has little value and is precious in the relationship of 1 to 6 to the dragon, who carries the Aesculapian staff. Then the very restless, nervous dragon becomes quiet and goes to sleep, after which two sources, two springs of white and green water, arise and flow over it and absorb it. When the next summer heat comes, the water which has drowned the dragon evaporates, and its corpse lies at the bottom of the sea. When thrown into the fire, it returns to life, and resumes its wings, which it apparently had lost, and flies away. But the child, conceived by absorbing the cheap precious things, is left behind in the fire. Because that child, that fetus, was born in the fire, it can nourish itself like a salamander till it has grown up. Then it becomes quite red, and of blood color, and has to be washed in water, which is luckier than that in which the dragon was drowned. You have to wash the mother, dripping her into the water so that sick people can be cured. Dorn then suddenly jumps to the sick, whose bodies become pale, their souls separating from the blood, a process that overtakes all bodies. If one then takes this soul, which has now become healthy and freed by the simplicity of its power from all its imperfections, and only the philosophers will know this, then this soul is the most complete medicine and the most simple thing. Nothing corrupt has been left in the human body. The soul revivifies everything which is sick, and transforms it into a moderate balance. The soul, or medicine, moderates everything which is without measure, and by its own innermost simplicity it creates peace between mortal enemies and gives them back into life, God willing. It even brings dead bodies back to life, and brings health back to their sick bodies. This is an effort to show what the work is and what it says. Quote, "We give cheap and precious food to the dragon." Chemically, that would mean that we use the mystical gold, the form gold, and throw it into mercury in the relationship of 1 to 6. That is to say, we repeat the creation of the world. Namely, we take that mystical creative power of the Godhead and confront it with, or make it penetrate into, the material reality of man. I thought that was a really interesting passage, and I'm going to relate it to something that Nietzsche says in Thus Spake Zarathustra. But just a few pages later on in this book about alchemical active imagination, I thought there was a little interesting bit here that I relate to Jordan Peterson. Quote, "You should not forget that Dorn was primarily not looking to find this inner child, or the form of gold, or to be in touch with God's creativity for his own inner beatitude or salvation, though he mentions that too. But he was a passionate physician who was really seeking cures for his patients." And I think you can see a sort of historical line drawn from Dorn, who was a physician looking to heal his patients, to maybe Nietzsche, I'm not sure, and then definitely to Jung, and then definitely to Jordan Peterson in our day. I think I kind of put that little graphic there. And now this part in Nietzsche sort of goes over similar transformations that you just heard about. And again, they're similar. I'm not sure if they're similar because they're referencing the same kind of literature. Like this might be referencing Ovid. I'm not positive. If you know about the 3 metamorphoses in Thus Spake Zarathustra, feel free to comment what you know about it. But I'm just going to read this couple of paragraphs from Thus Spake Zarathustra because it's really fascinating to me. And I think it relates here. "Of 3 metamorphoses of the spirit do I tell you. How the spirit becomes a camel, the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. Many heavy things are there for the spirit, the strong reverent spirit that would bear much, for the heavy and the heaviest longs its strength. What is heavy? So asks the spirit that would bear much, and then kneels down like the camel, and wants to be well laden. What is the heaviest thing, you heroes? Asks the spirit that would bear much, that I may take it upon me and exult in my strength. Is it not this, to humiliate oneself in order to mortify one's pride, to exhibit one's folly in order to mock at one's wisdom? Or is it this, to desert our cause when it triumphs, to climb high mountains to tempt the tempter? Or is it this, to feed on the acorns and grass of knowledge, and for the sake of truth to suffer hunger in one's soul? Or is it this, To be sick and send away the comforters, and to make friends of the deaf, or who never hear your requests? Or is it this, to go into foul water, when it is the water of truth, and not avoid cold frogs and hot toads? Or is it this, to love those who despise us, and to give one's hand to the phantom who tries to frighten us? All these heaviest things the spirit that would bear much takes upon itself. The camel, that when laden hastens into the desert, so speeds the spirit into its desert. But in the loneliest desert happens the second metamorphosis. Here the spirit becomes a lion. He will seize his freedom and be master in his own wilderness. Here he seeks his last master. He wants to fight him, and his last god. For victory, he will struggle with the great dragon. Who is the great dragon, which the spirit no longer wants to call Lord and God? Quote, "Thou shalt," is the great dragon called. But the spirit of the lion says, "I will." "Thou shalt" lies in his path, sparkling with gold, a scale-covered beast, and on each scale glitters a golden "Thou shalt." The values of 1,000 years glitter on those scales, and thus speaks the mightiest of all dragons. All values of all things glitter on me. All value has long been created, and I am all created value. Verily there shall be no more "I will." Thus speaks the dragon. My brothers, why does the spirit need the lion? Why is the beast of burden, which renounces and is reverent, not enough? To create new values, that even the lion cannot accomplish, but to create for oneself freedom for new creating, that freedom the might of the lion can seize. To create freedom for oneself and give a sacred no even to duty, for that, my brothers, the lion is needed. To assume the right to new values, that is the most terrifying assumption for a load-bearing and reverent spirit. To such a spirit it is praying and the work of a beast of prey. He once loved "thou shalt" as the most sacred. Now he is forced to find illusion and arbitrariness, even in the most sacred things, that freedom from his love may be his prey. The lion is needed for such prey. But tell me, my brothers, what the child can do, which even the lion could not do. Why must the praying lion still become a child? The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-rolling wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. For the game of creation, my brothers, a sacred yes is needed. The spirit now wills his own will. The world's outcast now conquers his own world. Of 3 metamorphoses of the spirit I have told you, how the spirit became a camel, the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. Thus spoke Zarathustra. If you've never heard that before, I think it's worth looking up for yourself and reading. It's going to come up again, I think, in the next Jordan Peterson paradox video, because he says a divine yes, something like that at the end there, and Karl Barth offers us over and over again the divine no, the divine negation. And you can see right there Nietzsche's talking about, how you can come to create your own values. And that's what, of course, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris were constantly talking about in their discussions. And, well, you can draw your own conclusions from that. So I want to look at this paragraph I just read in page 4 one more time in reverse. So if you start from the last sentence and work backwards, Jordan defines psychology as that which is focused on the interpretation of subjective frames of reference. And then he says that the history of science is an examination of outdated objective ideas. And finally he says fantastical contamination is imaginative and mythological association peculiar to the medieval mind. And I think it's helpful to kind of look at it backwards like that, and I'll go into it forward so we can see it backwards and forwards. So if you're going to read it plainly, he says, we can barely understand such a description, contaminated as it is by imaginative and mythological associations peculiar to the medieval mind. It is precisely this fantastical contamination, however, that renders the alchemical description worth examining, not from the perspective of the history of science, concerned with the examination of outdated objective ideas, but from the perspective of psychology, focused on the interpretation of subjective frames of reference. And now I'm going to move on, and then I'll break down the next paragraph, but I'm going to read it first. Quote, in it, the Indian Ocean in this example, are images of heaven and earth, of summer, autumn, winter, and spring, male and female. If thou callest this spiritual, what thou doest is probable. If corporeal, thou sayest the truth. If heavenly, thou liest not. If earthly, thou hast well spoken. End quote. The alchemist could not separate his subjective ideas about the nature of things, that is, his hypotheses, from the things themselves. His hypotheses, in turn, products of his imagination, were derived from the unquestioned and unrecognized explanatory presuppositions that made up his culture. The medieval man lived, for example, in a universe that was moral, where everything, even ores and metals, strived, above all, for perfection. Things, for the alchemical mind, were therefore characterized in large part by their moral nature, by their impact on what we would describe as affect, emotion, or motivation, were therefore characterized by their relevance or value, which is impact on affect. Description of this relevance took narrative form, mythic form, as in the example drawn from Jung, where the sulfuric aspect of the sun's substance is attributed negative, demonic characteristics. It was the great feat of science to strip affect from perception, so to speak, and to allow for the description of experiences purely in terms of their consensually apprehensible features. However, it is the case that the affects generated by experiences are real as well. Fantastical contamination. When I read this, I read it in a couple of different ways. I'm not sure which is the right way. This is almost like the disgust language Jordan often notes regarding Hitler's dinner conversations. Jordan is so much part of the scientific world, of that mindset, that he uses such language to describe the medieval mind, which is not that mindset. So he's either talking that way in disgust about this mindset, or, which I think would be kind of strange given everything he's laid out, because anyway, or he's saying he's writing this from that perspective, and it's not his personal perspective, but one of the scientific community as it stands as a whole. And so maybe that's how he means it. I'm not sure. So then I just have this for reference in case I needed to reference it again. So that now he has alchemy and the hypotheses. So the alchemist could not separate his subjective ideas about the nature of things, that is, his hypotheses, from the things themselves. His hypotheses were products of his imagination. And I go over this in the Missing Link video. It's one of my first, might be the first video I ever did. And that's where I highlight Jordan talking to Salieri at the Ayn Rand Institute discussion. And him and Salieri are both trying to figure out, like, they bring up Newton and Newton's theory of inertia and such. And they're trying to figure out, it's not exactly algorithmic. It's not exactly logic that's bringing forth this theory of inertia. It's something else. And at the time on stage, neither man figured out the right word to use. And I would say Jordan uses it right here. It's imagination. Imagination is sort of the fertile soil from which these products grow. And here he's using the word that I think is proper, but there, of course, he's on the spot. It's many decades after he's written this book. So whatever, I think I explained it in the missing link video. So these are derived from unquestioned and unrecognized explanatory presuppositions that made up his culture. So, what are the explanatory presuppositions? Well, one could be that God created the world, and this God is we're made in his image, so he is a being that has a personality, and he is a being that needs chaos and order, or not needs that's more like us. He's a being that is creative, and he created some kind of order. So now, therefore, there's an order reflected in the natural world. That's where St. Thomas says it's okay to think the thoughts of God after him. That is to figure out how the natural world works, what is the order in the world. And without that okay, without making that culturally acceptable, and that's what basically one man did for all of Europe, Thomas Aquinas, according to Charles Murray, who wrote Human Accomplishment. You would not have the scientific revolution, and you wouldn't have all these great things that Sam Harris likes to talk about. So alchemy and the medieval presuppositions. One of the presuppositions was the universe was moral because of the moral creator. This meant that everything strove for perfection, and these are characterized, you characterize things by their moral nature, and this is the impact on affect that they have, which is also said to be the impact on emotion or motivation. That's all under affect. Therefore, characterized by their relevance or value, this is the impact on affect. So everything is sort of ordered by its level of perfection and how it affects your affect, your emotional state or motivational state. This description took the form of narrative and myth. And so there you start to see how Jung organizes it. He sort of does a higher level abstraction and understands it on another level that way. So here I have that paragraph again. So what we just went over is his hypotheses, in turn, products of his imagination, were derived from the unquestioned and unrecognized explanatory presuppositions that made up his culture. The medieval man lived, for example, in a universe that was moral, where everything, even ores and metals, strived above all for perfection. Things for the alchemical mind were therefore characterized in large part by their moral nature, by their impact on what we would describe as affect, emotion, or motivation, were therefore characterized by their relevance or value, which is impact on affect. Description of this relevance took narrative form, mythic form, as in the example drawn from Jung, where the sulfuric aspect of the sun's substance is attributed negative, demonic characteristics. It was the great feat of science to strip affect from perception, so to speak, and to allow for the description of experiences purely in terms of their consensually apprehensible features. However, it is the case that the affects generated by experiences are real as well. I found this kind of interesting. The great feat of science, how he describes it that way, was to strip affect from perception. And I think back, on page 3, he was talking about the natural mind, the natural man, how one naturally perceives the world as these things are not stripped one from the other, they're combined. So any kind of object in the world has their objective qualities and their subjective qualities all mixed up into one, and how it affects your affect couldn't be stripped from it without leaving it as an empty husk. I think that's the word he uses, husk. So this allowed for the description of experiences purely in terms of their consensually apprehensible features, and Northrop Frye talks about this, and William Blake talks about this, and I think Northrop Frye coins it as the lowest common denominator perception, LCD, and I equate that to something like a camera lens. So instead of apprehending the world with a human eye and a human mind behind that eye, there is just, the eye is turned into a lens, and it's just the camera lens that is experiencing the world. This supposes that the affects generated by experiences are not real, but they're real too. And that's something that William Blake and Northrop Frye fought a lot about, or for. They fought for that position. Because William Blake is famously quoted when asked if the sun looks like a yellow guinea in the sky, like a yellow golden coin. Blake famously responded that he does not see just a guinea, but the whole heavenly host singing holy, holy, holy. And so he had an imaginative perception of the sky. He had an active, as Jung would say, active imagination. And the alchemical active imagination, like I said, look up that book, it's interesting. But active imagination in Jungian terms was Jung's way of exploring the unconscious. And if you want to look at Jung's exploration of his unconscious, where he says he finds his soul, look up the Red Book. And I think I mentioned that a while ago. But that's a real trip, and it's really fascinating and interesting to read. It was never published in his lifetime. It was something he only showed to some close friends while he was alive. And I believe it was only published in 2012 or 14, something like that. So just a few years ago. So even for Jordan Peterson, it might be something that, was newly impressed upon him just a few years ago. All right, so this is, if I had to refer to this, this is, again, that last few sentences. It was the great feat of science to strip affect from perception, so to speak, and to allow the description of experiences purely in terms of their consensually apprehensible features. However, it is the case that the affects generated by experiences are real as well. Just to drive that point home. Now I'm plugging my Twitter, but this slide got messed up. I guess it just dumped a bunch of pictures in here. But I think this is hilarious. This is, again, something I post on Twitter. Again, Jordan Peterson related. Whenever I see heckin' archetypal right here, that just cracks me up right there. Again, this is that Sam Harris thing. I labeled this a rare candid photo of Sam Harris constructing his worldview. This is something I showed you at the beginning, Jordan Peterson constructing his worldview compared to Sam Harris. Here's something I quoted from Karl Barth. The conscious recognition of suffering is the gateway to knowledge and redemption, which is in Jesus Christ. God reckons with us precisely at the door of suffering. There it is that he justifies himself in our presence and teaches us through his Spirit to cry, Abba, Father. Now, just looking at this little quote, you can really see a lot of Jordan Peterson in that, right? So you can see perhaps the old ideas that Jordan's drawing from deep within Christianity. Oh yeah, there's that picture again, heckin' archetypal. I should put that as an outro or an intro where things get heckin' archetypal. Maybe I'll just cut it out of this video where I say heckin' archetypal several times. Let's get heckin' archetypal. Every video we should start getting heckin' archetypal. Oh, and this is what I most recently posted. I think Vanderklay retweeted this, where I have Sam Harris as this fuzzy avocado plushy doll thing, and he says, act out of love, guided by reason. And of course that's good enough when you're this stuffed animal on a bed in the first world, right? But in the first world in modern times. But then Jordan Peterson comes along and he just says, that's just not enough, Sam. It's just not enough. And you can just see like this ancient destroyer of days, with the a great pyramid floating behind him, a celestial being of sorts coming out, and there's just tiny people down here compared to this great thing. This is the reckoning this is what Jordan Peterson has reckoned with, the deep seated psyche of man that can be horrible at times. And these are things that I don't think this plush avocado realizes. Again, these are just things I post on my Twitter if you're interested in seeing that. Oh man, let's get heckin' archetypal again. Okay, that's how I'm going to end this. We're going to get heckin' archetypal for the next Jordan Peterson paradox video. And if you like any of these things, follow me on Twitter and like and subscribe. Don't forget to like the videos, because the YouTube algorithms, they run on how long you watch and how many likes the videos get. So everything helps, right? Thanks a lot.